Welcome to Jameel Arts Center, and it's so great to see such a good turnout tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Dawn Ross, and I'm head of collections at Art Jameel, and we're really excited to open this series of artist rooms, which includes 3 solo shows by artists Cynthia Mahina Simpson, Augustine Paredes, and Amba Sayal-Bennett. The artist room exhibitions, they're drawn largely from the Art Jameel Collection and are a series of solo exhibitions by artists by artists with particular focus on practitioners from West Asia, South Asia, and Africa. These capsule shows are collaborative and curated in dialogue with the artists, and we're delighted to have 2 of the artists with us here tonight. We have Augustine, who will be speaking first, followed by Amba. And we'll also have Cynthia, who will be coming here later in the year. She's coming in October, and we'll be doing a talk and performance at that time. We're also excited to be launching a new series of talks called Artists on Artists that are in association with the artist rooms. This series fosters collaboration and discussion among both local and international artists, building connections and providing a platform for deeper conversations. These discussions will extend beyond the exhibitions and also delve into aspects of the artist's practice that are often not visible. Augustine and Amba will be in discussion with 2 other artists from the Art Jameel Collection. We have Khalid Mezaina and Sarah Almehairi, who's here tonight. Augustine will be speaking with Khalid, and Amba will be in conversation with Sarah. And I'll just introduce both Amba and Sarah. Amba works across drawing, projection, and sculpture installations. Her practice explores how methods of abstraction are exclusionary and performative, crafting boundaries between what is present, manifestly absent, and othered. Her recent work focuses on the migration of modernist forms and their role within fascist and brutalist architecture. She uses translation as method and explores the movement of bodies, knowledge, and form across different sites. Amba received her BFA from Oxford University and her MA in sculpture from the Royal College of Art. She was awarded her PhD in art practice and learning from Goldsmiths, University of London, and has published her practice-based research with Tate Papers. She is currently an associate lecturer at Camberwell College of Arts. Sarah is an artist and poet whose overarching body of work unfolds a discourse on themes of materiality, systems and interrelations, and language through the intuitive and poetic examination of narrative and abstraction. By engaging with geometric forms, she extracts and defines the structural language, read time and time again to suggest a form other than its own. A map, a sentence, a puzzle piece. Through the process, they are broken down, built, reassembled as continuous iterations of themselves. These elements towards telling a story are not so explicit. Lines and layers are used throughout her pieces as a means of exploring clarity and organization of collected information. Working primarily with the investigative range of media, she explores the push and pull of material to evoke a story that both conceals and reveals itself. She received her BA in Art and Art History from NYU Abu Dhabi, and then she is also the co-founder of the Jara Collective.
Little applause. All right, just want to say thank you for everyone that is joining us here today. We had a conversation back in 2020, the year of COVID, but we don't speak about it anymore. So we're just resurfacing those conversations, and I think we've had so much growth in both of our careers since then, and it's about time. All right, so we put a presentation together on our conversation that we had a few weeks back and continue to do so. Yeah, so I have one question for you, and we can just go back and forth, keep it casual. The theme of abstraction is a bit daunting for those that are not in the art world. It's sometimes really difficult, I think, for those that are not in our space and not in our work always to be able to interact with work that is not so obvious in its ways. And yeah, my question to you is how do you use abstraction to your advantage or maybe disadvantage in your work?
Hi. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction and for the wonderful talk before. I think that was something that we were talking about resonances in our practice and having quite different approaches to abstraction and the role that it plays within our practice. I guess for me, abstraction seems like something that brackets out a material context. And in some work that was for a show curated by Murtaza Wali called Proposals for a Memorial to Partition. I think the first iteration was at Jameel, and the second iteration, which I had work in, was at 12 Gates, which is a space in Philadelphia. I was thinking about how abstraction could be a kind of distancing device or protective mechanism. And I think there was a focus on highlighting marginalized narratives, and it was quite different to the way that I usually work. So it started with conversations with my grandmother about her lived experience of partition. And she lived in Derby, which is in the Midlands in the UK. And so me and my mum, who's here, went to visit her. And we were speaking to her about her experiences, and my mum asked her why she had called her house in Derby Dera. And she replied, I was born in Dera, Pakistan. My grandparents came from Dera. It means shelter. I was without a home, so this is my shelter. It's synonymous with home. And I think in several South Asian languages, Dera also means camp, mound, and settlement. So I was thinking about, I guess the work used this kind of schematic to think about processes of homemaking in the context of displacement. And drawing became a kind of speculative practice or way to engage with these places that I haven't visited but had kind of spoken to her about and didn't have a lived experience of. But I think in the work I was thinking about how abstraction became, a kind of protective mechanism or distancing device, a way to engage with those histories at a distance or in a kind of oblique way. And I was also thinking about abstraction in naming, so how Dara was kind of decentered when it was abstracted as a name, and how that kind of connection through naming enabled an entanglement of these two sites when a kind of access to that physical location was no longer possible. And then in terms of I guess in terms of more recent work, I have an upcoming show at Tark in Mumbai in August, and the site is next to a botanical garden called Rani Bagh. It used to be a colonial botanical garden. I've been looking into botanical drawing and was reading an interesting text in the context of like object-based learning by Judy Wilcox and Kieran Mahone. But they were talking about how I guess botanical drawings became part of the machinery that monetized plants. And I thought it was quite interesting because of the difficulty in transporting specimens. A lot of botanical drawings would be made in situ. And the drawings featured the plants like on a completely blank background. And they were saying that, I guess by viewing the specimens in this way as divorced from an ecosystem or context, it enabled them to be seen for their potential economic value. And so that kind of extraction from an ecosystem or abstraction made them more available for circulation. But I think when we were having a conversation, I thought it was interesting that you were talking about abstraction as a kind of limitation in your practice, and I wonder if you could speak more about how you see the role of abstraction in your work.
Yeah, no, it's okay, I got it. All right. I mean, let me just comment also on this idea of like this protective mechanism. I think it's really interesting when abstraction comes into play that there's this method of like concealment and revealment that comes through even in the process of making works. I mean, when we had our conversation, I was like, let me put this work up right next to yours because every time I look at it, I'm like, that looks like Amba's work. Every time. And even when I was making the work, like the idea of figuration also in abstraction is really prominent in both our works. But we don't maybe talk about it as much. We want to conceal it within the abstraction as well. But yeah, also it's like this idea of which I think is really interesting, is like this familiarity that happens also in abstraction, because it breaks it down to these points where people can actually start to work with the work a little bit more, like find, I mean, Augustine and Khalid were saying that as well, like find a part of themselves or something that they're familiar with within the work itself. And yeah, so I think it's a great transition to talk about maybe dimensionality within our works, from this work to the next. Could you talk, is this work in the show?
This work isn't in the show. No.
Okay, you have things that are similar that look like it in the show, but if you want to talk about it a little bit, and then we can just go back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I use translation a lot in my work, and I think of my work as very drawing-based. And I think drawing has that kind of potential for use. Sometimes it's like a record of an action. I guess it also has this kind of elastic relationship to time as well. It can be an index, or it could be notation or something that can be reinterpreted. But there's also like a real flatness to the way that I work, I think, which is quite visible in this piece here. So I work a lot with metal. This is mild steel, which is bent and powder coated. But I always think that metal has quite a strong relationship to paper or card or something you can kind of fold. And I hadn't really thought about how like flat my thinking was until I did a carving residency with two artists, Holly Graham and Erin Hughes, who I'm part of a collective with. It was part of research for a show, and yeah, I was really struggling to conceptualize the form within a piece of rock, and way better at looking at reliefs. And I guess because I work digitally, so I use computer-aided design programs like Rhino, there's a split screen, so you can see four things or four views at the same time, which is quite an impossible perspective, and you can also see through volumes. But even with that, there's a kind of interface or a flattening in terms of how I'm encountering 3D objects. But I think with those works and working with those kind of digital programs, it means that the drawing also has a kind of potential for a physical output, whether it's coupled with like another machine for CNC milling or laser cutting. But I think also was it these works you were talking about, that transition between dimensions and how some of the kind of the wooden parts also relate very directly to other flattened elements within the work.
Yeah, I feel like my practice in general, I always think of things as sculptural, even if it's language, whether it's a paper on the wall. I think it's really interesting that you said that your work was flat to begin with. I mean, that is really interesting in its dimensionality as well. I don't know if this is the best work. I don't think I chose the best work to talk about dimensionality with this one. But I mean, when I first started out my practice, I was working a lot with wood as a natural material in this layering process. And then I kind of left that to the side for a bit and went into painting, thinking painting was flat. Little did I know that it has so much dimensionality within its surface, its texture, even color within itself. And my latest series called Off-Centered, I like to put painting and sculpture together. And so that's what that is. It's a merging of some sort, but also within myself, I feel like, yes, it's on a white wall, but if it moves anywhere else, like, does the work change as well? So there's always this element of, you know, from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, but also the surfaces that it interacts with. And I think it's a really beautiful representation of that in your artist room today. I mean, we just popped in before the talk, and I got to see the works in many different presentations, and the way that you've transformed the space is absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
I was also going to ask about, because we were talking a bit about reusing elements as well, and thinking about modularity and the kind of, but I wonder in these, are there elements that are repeated or reused in these kind of iterations and configurations?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I love math. I don't say this a lot, but I really do. I love measurements and I love numbers, and so like when I'm creating the work, I'm using it's like self-referential. So I'm using the work itself to kind of mark make with the paint. And I think we were also speaking about like this transfer between like the digital realm to the physical realm. And when I create my paintings now, I actually sketch them up digitally before I do anything to the surface. And it's really interesting that change between like the digital and the physical. These little like minute details that just happen between those two surfaces or these two ways of working. And I believe you said something about that as well upon our conversation, like reusing these like measurements, or is it just like forms as well?
Yeah, I think because I've been using, I mean, with the works on paper, I use drawing stencils, so there's a kind of physical limitation there. And I've always been interested in how those things, I guess, delimit certain parameters for engagement. And within the Rhino drawings, which is this computer-aided design programs, I've started using the three-dimensional volumes almost as stencils themselves. So the forms become way to generate more forms. So you'll see one of the works in the artist room is a structure that has another structure kind of stretched behind it. But I also use different volumes to kind of subtract from each other to generate a third form, which will be like the kind of material effects of I guess, yeah, the effects of difference from those two shapes. So I think I've been thinking about modularity and working with modularity as a way to generate greater complexity within forms, and I guess in a way that I'm not kind of directly shaping them, but yeah, reusing them in that sense.
I think that's where like both of our practices are quite intertwined in the sense that we like to reuse within, whether it be layering, whether it be form, or even repetition of color. I mean, for myself as well, like I use inspiration from my past work, the one that I had just, completed. I used the best details or my most favorite details onto the next one, and that's like how that thread kind of goes through the work. So do you feel like you kind of take the best of each and take it forward? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's also like having things saved. There's so many things that are not fully used, but even with the drawings, elements come back. So there's that kind of internal frame of referencing as well.
All right. I mean, even speaking about like our ways of working, definitely mine has changed over the years, and I believe you had mentioned that as well. And so we wanted to also just talk about like tools in our ways of work. Yeah, we should change it. Tools in our way of working. The work on your right is what I was referencing before, which is these woodworks that I was working with in this like active layering. But if you want to go ahead and talk about, your different tools first.
I've just realized we're sitting on the right side with the works. I picked this piece mainly for this discussion around tools, because I'm always interested in how they have a kind of agency in the making process. And before I was using Rhino, which is quite a powerful program, I was using SketchUp, which is quite angular and rudimentary, and you make very fixed geometries and you can extrude certain parts. And when I transitioned to using Rhino, it kind of felt like I wasn't working fluently in either program, mainly because working in this new software, I was importing like a certain logical way of working in it, and there were resistances in how the program was receiving that. So this is a piece that one of the first works I made totally in Rhino. And I think even being consciously aware of the active role of the technology and how it affects the aesthetic of the work, I still didn't fully recognize it as mine, which was quite a strange feeling of that, thinking about authorship and maybe discomfort around that as well. But yeah, I mean, in terms of one of the works in the show, Strike Route, which was part of an exhibition last year at Carbon 12, which is the gallery we work with, the show was called Architectures of Excess. And I'd been thinking about legacies of modernist architecture and been particularly interested in a text by Adolf Loos called Ornament and Crime, which talks about how modernism's governing principle is that form should follow function, and it's this complete rejection of ornamentation within architectural practice. And I was thinking about how to kind of work with or work against those histories, and thinking about how ornamentation could be a kind of irritant or a way to kind of react against them. And while I work, I don't know if you do this as well, listen to things in the studio, but I can't read while I'm drawing, so I'll watch lectures or listen to podcasts and things like that. I always have to be partially distracted while I'm working. But I was going through this kind of archive of Architectural Association lectures on ornamentation, and someone was talking about how there's this kind of under-theorized ornamental renaissance within architectural practice, which has been enabled by digital processes, which I thought was quite interesting because those are processes that I use in my own work. And that kind of ease of replication and duplication, I guess you know it when you're doing like copy and paste, lends itself to that, but also the kind of economic viability by these things being kind of cheaper to produce or more accessible, things that would have traditionally been done by very, very skilled craftspeople. So I thought it was interesting, this idea of a kind of technological agency enabling this kind of comeback of ornamentation within design, or something that could be flying under the radar and isn't necessarily consciously being integrated, but is present. I guess in terms of the tools, but yeah, I wonder, is this a collection of objects?
Yeah, so the work that you see on the right, they're pieces of wooden cast-off, so recyclable wood, and I don't alter them at all. It's just this idea of like building upon them, taking things away. And again, like just like the work that you saw previously that was more of a painting, I use the tools or the forms that are already in there to kind of guide my way of making and thinking throughout the work as well. One tool that I use like within my practice from the beginning till the end is the idea of the grid, which I think is quite present. And I wonder if that's also a tool that you use in yours.
I mean, I think the grid is present as a like location, as a way to find location within the 3D model. But in terms of the final work, maybe more with the drawings and the works on paper. Are these offcuts from other works, or?
Yeah, they're from like a carpenter's shop or a maker space. I just take the scraps because I like to work with constraint, and we can also think of like a tool, like constraint as a tool as well. And you had said something when we were speaking earlier about like tools as collaborators, and I think that's just a brilliant sentence if you want to expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to that idea of who's producing what, and that kind of, I mean, definitely in terms of thinking about how much my work's changed through the different devices that I've been using. I mean, I would also say that I use Rhino, which is quite a powerful program, but the way that I use things is incredibly naive, so I've never like formally learned how to use it. I've kind of taught myself through YouTube tutorials and a lot of trial and error. So I think there's inherently this kind of misuse in a program, or using something in a way that's not necessarily intended to be used. But I think for me that has more potential because it creates more room for accident, or for unanticipated effects. And I think that is an area that I think gives the tools more agency maybe, rather than a kind of more controlled approach.
Do you feel like you have let go of control as your practice has moved forward?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in some ways they look incredibly controlled. But I think that's also maybe the kind of digital language that, persists in the real world. I also think rephotographing pieces that have originated digitally then look like renders when they're rephotographed or flattened again.
I mean, also just speaking about tools, I think something that we both use in our practice in different ways is the act of writing. So I don't think it's talked a lot with like artists in general. So I feel like it was a great topic to bring into the space today. So do you want to give a little intro of how maybe you use writing, or language? We can broaden it up.
I think when we had the initial conversation, it was really interesting in this different approach to writing, different relationship to it. You were talking about really enjoying it and the kind of pleasure in the practice, and the writing is like a daily practice. And I guess I'm quite dyslexic, and I often forget or have normalized how long it takes me to like read and write. And so for me, reading has never been like a pleasurable practice. It's always been really difficult. I don't read fiction. I only read like denser texts because I find visually having to decode something is easier for me to focus on. And yeah, I don't know, with this work, which I saw in Al Sakal last year. Was it last year? Yeah. There's a real lightness, but then also complexity in terms of the way you work. So I think, yeah, reflecting on my own writing, it's always quite dense and functional in a way.
Yeah.
But I put this work up because it's the drawing projections were part of some research I was doing, which involved it was a practice-based approach, but thinking about looking at other artists' work or video artists working with filmic techniques within video. And in these works, which use a kind of layering, I was thinking about exploring this diffraction or disruption that happens through the encounter of two materials. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of feeds into more like research-based writing, but I wonder if you could tell us more about this work.
One thing I think also that we share is I started off my work as always seeing it as language or seeing it as text, and I was always trying to decode it or conceal it in such a way. And I think this was the first time I actually had put in text out into space, but also just text in general, like working with language and like putting it in also a public realm. I mean, even when thinking about this work, it was like, do I put it in English? Do I put it in Arabic? Do I put it in another language as well? And so like, it gets a bit interesting in those decisions as well.
There was a really nice dynamic. I mean, even when I was walking around Al Sakar, I was kind of looking on the floor. I guess there's that kind of, the history of the work that has also changed my experience of that space. I was looking out for those paving stones where you'd kind of taken out blocks in the ground and then put objects that you'd found around the site. So there was this kind of dynamic between looking down and up, which I think usually are places that you don't tend to look when you're walking around certain environments.
Yeah, and I feel like the objects that were in the ground are also just another idea of language and form as language as well. And so I feel like that's really present in your work. When you think about maybe writing, do you ever think of projection as writing or sculpture as writing or drawing as writing? Like, how do you approach those different languages and different forms as well?
I mean, when I read this, it kind of creates a visual diagram. So I think maybe the link there is this kind of like the relationship between things that's created through writing or through these kind of object-based formats or.
I mean, you also work with different surfaces, so like, is that also a way? I mean, when we write down, right? But like, you're also working with multiple surfaces, and so, yeah, I think that's quite interesting to speak upon. If you like.
Well, we were talking in the just before in the artist rooms about the orientation of the drawings and like how they're displayed. I mean, not in the same proximity, but definitely at the same angle which I would have drawn them. Which I think through that relation links them more to writing, and I guess even drawing is something that's also like everyone can relate to, whether you're not an artist, which I think is something quite special about it. I mean, another thing we were also talking about was collaborative practice. And I mean, we were first in conversation through your artist talks.
Yeah.
We were all in lockdown, weren't they? Yeah. So I know you have quite an active practice working with other collaborators and other artists.
Yeah, I mean, I like to work with people. So like the artist talks was just a way for me to collaborate and also just speak to other artists during lockdown. That's how we were interacting. But something that is current and also going through a revision is this publishing collective that me and my friend Shema, who's sitting right over there, is a part of. It's a publishing collective where we're planning to do a project a year, and so I feel like it's also these spaces, and also like today we can take as an example as a great way to like bring artists together and like create these spaces. And yeah, but also within your room, I think it's quite beautiful to see like your work spanning from many different years coming together as once. And so like all these collaborative spaces, I think are something to keep an eye out on. Is that a good way to end the talk, or do you want to say something? No?
Yeah, we'll open it up for questions. So,
I wanted to ask if any of you guys are inspired by fashion or like by different pieces of clothing within your work. Yeah.
Do the artists want to answer first? Or I mean, I can answer quickly. Sure, yeah. To answer your question, it does, but not in a commercial sense, right? So I am thinking of, especially in my textile works, I'm thinking about the body, but I'm not necessarily thinking about apparel. I'm thinking about I mean, I guess the technical word would be garments. So garments are more textiles that are relating to the body, but they're for exhibition purposes. They don't necessarily need to be on the body to translate. They could be considered kind of costume or performative type of textiles or garment pieces. So yeah, to answer, yes, but I think I'm very far from considering doing 4 seasons, like collections for 4 seasons and stuff like that. So that's not where my world lies. So yeah.
I mean, I work as a fashion photographer. That's the commercial aspect of my career. In terms of work, in terms of my art practice, I think the same way that Khalid talked about the textiles, and to me, I think the methods of making of a fashion designer and the way they manipulate fabric and they kind of further the fabric and its capacities and its tensions within different types of materials are inherently part of my making, and also fashion in a sense of styling also comes within my photographic practice, not only as a commercial photographer but as a fine art photographer. Yeah, so fashion and style kind of, because it is part of my persona and my life, it somehow finds its way through my art practice.
I have a question for Amba, if I may. So you spoke earlier about the tooling and relinquishing control because you just can't control that at a certain point. I was wondering if you can speak to that experience. Did it come from you realizing, okay, I have no control over this, I have to accept it for my or did it come from being pleasantly surprised at some point by something you didn't expect, and so you let that progress that way?
Thanks for the question.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think definitely the latter. Thinking about accident as a kind of method actually came through working with the projections. And I think from slight misalignment or, I mean, even trying to relearn how to use the projections and the materials was a real process, even kind of remaking certain elements while I've been here. But because it's quite a delicate device and it's a very old like analog machine, even the mirror that reflects the image can displace. So even knocking things in the studio, it happened more in terms of like physical proximity to materials in my making space, more so than with the digital methods. But I think in terms of the works as well, they're quite modular once they're made. So there's that potential for reconfiguration or reuse or displacement. But
well, before we finish, I just wanted to hand over to Antonio Carver, director at Art Jameel, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm going to be super fast because I know everyone wants to see the show, and then we also have Augustine's performance at 6:30 as well. But thank you, first of all, to Augustine, Amba, Sarah, and to Khalid. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear you speak to each other. Really enjoyed it a lot. Thank you. And yes, come on, everybody. Big round of applause. And thank you also to Sanchithia, who's not here this evening, but as Dawn mentioned, she'll be back, the third artist room. She'll be back in the autumn as well. And thank you to all of you for being here on a very hot and steamy July Sunday. I think, it's a bit of a cliche, but it does take a village to raise an art scene, and definitely takes a lot of different kinds of arts organisations from across the spectrum to nurture the kinds of talent that you see in the artists' rooms this evening. And just a shout out to Carbon 12, to Koresh and Nadine, thank you so much. And also to GPP, to Gulf Photo Plus. I don't know whether Somji is here, Mohammed Somji and his team, but also thank you to them as well. Yes, thank you. And also a few other quick shout-outs. We'd like to also thank Josh Milani for lending a work to the show alongside Carbon 12, and to our fantastic contributors to our publications. That we have 3 Artist Rooms books, which are published this evening as well, which are with Marianne at the back there, and being launched tonight, designed in-house at Art Jameel together with Chemistry. And Zishi Han and Adwait Singh both wrote really beautiful essays alongside the writings by Augustine and by Sanchinthia as well. So they're a different take on the artist books, and I really, really recommend them a lot. I'd also really like to thank everybody from the Art Jameel team that worked so hard on the exhibitions. You have to forgive me, there are a few names, but it takes a village and all that. So thank you to Barish, to Zahra, to Dania, to Giacomo, Nassif, Dina, Rhoda, Ruba, Lama, Chris, Alex, Azim, Jana, and Francis, and Marianne. Again, thank you. It was really great. And my last thank you goes to Dawn, who curated these shows, and we've been, yes, thank you, Dawn. We first together thought of this series of artist rooms when we opened Jameel Art Centre in 2018. Those 3 opening ones, Maha Malouh, Munir Al-Soh, and Lala Roch, 3 sort of really standout women artists from the region and around. And to sort of continue that series up until this point and be celebrating such artists tonight feels really special. So thank you, Dawn, for all the work on the Art Jameel Collection. It's been an absolutely fantastic ride with you, and also putting together so many incredible shows and launching artists here. Thank you. I should say before we switch to everybody exploring that there is also another artist room, Tazir Batnici's work, Hanoun, on level 2, don't miss that, and also Khalid's work in the library. So please have an explore. Thank you so much, everybody.